Hi, my name is Mark Gordon. I'm the Chairman and Chief Executive Officer of Odyssey Marine Exploration. Odyssey's been in business and publicly traded now for over 30 years. And our business has been the deep ocean exploration business that entire time. And for the past 15 years, we've been highly focused on discovering, quantifying, and figuring out how to recover valuable mineral deposits from the ocean floor.
Mark, good to see you here. Yeah, it's a kind of step down from all that TV work, isn't it?
Yeah, but it's great to be here with you, Matthew. I like this a lot better.
Good man. Okay. Well, look, we're going to get into it. We might hark back to the past as well, because it kind of roots you in your experience at making discoveries at sea for sure. Well, let's start with you. So, what is your background, and what have you been doing?
Well, personally, it's interesting. My background is a businessman. However, I had worked my way through undergraduate and business school as a diver, a professional diver. Developed an interest for the ocean there, and then 20 years ago now, when I was recruited to come down and join Odyssey Marine Exploration, I was reunited with my passion of the ocean. And so I've been with Odyssey 20 of the 30 years it's been in business, and it's really interesting. I'm glad we're going to go back and talk about the history, because it was an interesting time in our history, but it also positioned us for what we're doing now, I think, quite well.
Right, and that was, just for people who don't know you, that was, you were going and chasing wreckages on the ocean floor around the world.
Yeah, in fact, we used to spend a good amount of our time in Europe this time of year, working in the English Channel and North Sea. What we were doing then was finding and recovering valuable cargoes from historic shipwrecks lost in the deep ocean beyond 1,000-foot water depth. And I think why that experience is so relevant and why it enabled us to pivot into seafloor minerals, which we'll spend a lot of time talking about today, is we learned how to use complicated equipment in the deep ocean, how to execute difficult projects in difficult environments. But interestingly, a lot of that business was the same as this. In other words, it started with desk-based research to identify where the best opportunities were. You had to be able to quantify where specifically you thought in the ocean your target was going to be, find that target, and then be able to work at great depths to recover those items. Sometimes this is oversimplifying it, but sometimes I say simply by changing out the science team on the boat, moving from archaeologists during the shipwreck business to geologists now, almost everything else is the same. The sophisticated sonar systems, the remotely operated submarines, the ships. Our past was good positioning for what has become our future.
Right, okay, and the future being these metal nodules on the base, on the seabed, I should say. It's obviously the value and the quantum of it is extraordinary. We've had one of your peers on the show a few times, and I think people understand the potential there. The block there has always been one of environmental and getting governments on board with this. But is that opened up now? Do people better understand it, or do you still have a lot of work to do on that?
Yeah, and it's interesting, again, a parallel to the prior business. In that case, there were scientists, in that case, archaeologists, who objected to the work being done on a commercial basis. Now, with minerals, to your point, we have people worried about the environmental impact. And by the way, we should all be worried about the environmental impact. I know we are. I know our peers like the metals company certainly is. And we're making big investments there. But I think in both cases, what you need is science and facts, not just opinions that are unjustified. Getting to answering your question now that you posed, we are seeing regulatory regimes starting to come into place in many countries around the world. We can talk about this more if you want to, but I think that the executive order issued by President Trump several weeks ago is an indication that the U.S. is getting very engaged and looking at refining their regulatory framework to accommodate it. So again, I think that governments, are reticent to sort of engage in something that's new and unproven for fear of what may happen. And I think now enough time has passed, enough science has been done where people are starting to understand that the critical minerals mankind is going to need into the future has to come from the 70% of our Earth that's underwater, because the 30% of the dry surface has been pretty exhausted after 2,000 years of mankind harvesting from the dry surface.
Right. Okay. And so we're going to put this in sort of, I guess, mining terms for conventional investors or investors of conventional mines. How do you guys go about securing the licenses or the properties? And what work is done to actually try and understand what the potential is in terms of that kind of commercial component?
Yeah, so I think there are a lot of parallels, and it varies from jurisdiction to jurisdiction. For instance, in Mexico, the offshore mining regulations very much mirror the terrestrial mining regulations, to the point where we actually had to place a monument on land in Mexico to reference where our concessions were located offshore. Having said that, otherwise it's the same, right? You have to specify the geographic plot that you want, the concession that you want, where you believe your minerals and resources are going to be, and then you pay a concession fee to have exploration rights, and then ultimately you have to migrate, just like in terrestrial mining, through an environmental approval process to get your extraction rights. And then once you're in the extraction mode, you're paying taxes and royalties based on production. So I think there are a lot of parallels between the two.
Right. But look, we're chasing these kind of polymetallic rocks, effectively, right, sitting on the surface. So this is more like a tailings kind of reclamation type operation rather than mining, where people are having to work out what's under the ground for you. Is that fair to say? Yeah,
so it's interesting. Very little overburden. So you're right. I think that is a good parallel that you've drawn. But in addition to whether it's polymetallic nodules, which is a big focus for us, also phosphate. In both cases, what you're finding is that the mineral set is basically uncovered or very amount of low amount, I should say, of overburden for extraction. Which the nice thing about that is you can use existing tools to be able to do the extraction work. So yeah, I guess the other big, if you were talking, so I've been complimenting you on the parallels so far, but if I were to talk about the differences, you also don't have to establish a lot of infrastructure like you would with terrestrial mining. First, especially with these remote terrestrial sites, roadways, railways, electrification, water systems, we're operating from a ship. The other nice thing about that is that your mining infrastructure is transportable. So if something goes wrong with the resource for whatever reason, or there's a geopolitical situation, you can actually move your mining infrastructure. So I think that's probably the biggest distinction, but otherwise terrestrial and seafloor mining are very similar.
Right, and I guess time as well is the usual often killer for companies. You can very quickly, I guess, again, mining terms, drill to kill. In this case, you quickly see what you're looking for. Is that right? And you can either move on or carry on.
Yeah. Now with the nodules, that's especially true because, as you mentioned, they're visible on the surface. And not only that, with sonar, we can quickly search an area, and based on reflectivity, we can judge whether those nodules are probably going to be there before we even launch a remotely operated submarine to see them.
Right. Okay. So I am kind of skewing this conversation towards the metallic nodules, but you quite rightly talked about well, we better get terminology right? Because people conflate a lot of these words, fertilizers and potash and other types of things. So let's be clear what you're chasing.
Yeah. So Odyssey's, look, I'll start by saying any mineral available on dry land will be available in the ocean. Odyssey, to answer your question now, has decided to focus on things that are important for mankind and in relatively short supply right now. So phosphate is one of our focuses. This is a critical element of fertilizer that can't be lab created. It must be found in nature. And we've identified an amazing resource off the Pacific coast of Mexico that's going to be a really important resource for food security in the Americas and in other parts of the world. The other focus is battery metals, because we think electrification is where we have to go. as a world population in order to have a sustainable future. So these polymetallic nodules that we've talked about a couple of times are critically important because they're almost like battery metals in a rock. You have cobalt, you have copper, you have all of the elements you need, including, in some cases, rare earth elements. So these are all critical minerals. So we see those are the two focuses for us right now: phosphate for the food supply and polymetallic nodules for the electrification of society.
Okay, and I will move the conversation along in those two silos in a second, but just want people to be kind of clear, what you are. So is the plan here to be an explorer, operator, licensor, incubator? I mean, how do you position yourselves?
Yeah, Matthew, it's an excellent question. Odyssey's roots are exploration. That's our strength. And so that's certainly a focus. But we're also very focused and have been over the years on securing the rights and executing the project. So I think that we're primarily an exploration company that will identify, quantify, and permit projects for extraction. I think maybe the distinction between companies like the metals company and us is that we may not necessarily be the company that carries out the extraction. We would likely have partners that would do that. So as an example, with the phosphate projects, we have Royal Mascalis, which is one of the largest dredging companies in the world, is our designated partner. They already own the dredge ships. There's no reason for us to recreate that. They're expert at doing it, and it really helps us not having to invest that CapEx, right? So I think we're, again, coming back to your question, we're explorers that know how to secure rights and quantify the value of a project, and we could get involved up to the extraction stage. We don't see ourselves ultimately, though, as being the company involved in the processing and final delivery of finished material. That would be partners.
Right. So in terms of then, securing these projects or these assets, more accurately, for now, where's the value line? Where's the how do you kind of optimize that in what is a fairly nascent space with very few participants at the moment? Is there a land grab to be had? Is that what you're focused on? Or how far do you think you need to move these projects along?
Yeah, you have great questions. Yes, absolutely. So you're developing assets, and developing assets would be, if you will, the land grab, figuring out what land to grab and then securing it. And then ultimately, obviously, the value will in time come off the production and the revenue production that results from the mining production. But in the short term, we think of things in a value curve. Very low value early in the project where you've spent very little money, but you've done desk-based research, as a specific example. Value gets established once you get to either your 43101 or JORC, depending on the standard you're going to use. There you've quantified the resource and you know what you have. So, as a specific example, every one of our projects right now is valued in the billions of dollars based on those resource measures. But obviously, you don't realize the net and you're valued at that point on the net present value of the resource, and then ultimately, on the actual revenue and profit production. So I guess coming back to your question, the land grab is important. We're building a diversified portfolio that covers the different mineral sets we've talked about in different geographic locations. I think something else unique about our strategy over some others that are doing this is that we're exclusively focused on exclusive economic zones, so dealing with a single government inside 200 nautical miles from their landmass. And we've just chosen that path, one, to get the geopolitical and commodity diversification, but also because, candidly, it's hard enough to deal with one government to get the regulatory approvals you mentioned earlier. And for us, it was pretty daunting to think about getting 160 some odd countries in the United Nations to give us a regulatory framework. By the way, I think that will ultimately succeed. It will ultimately be rectified, but we just chose this different path for our land grabs.
Right. Okay. So you potentially have multiple balance sheets, revenue streams, however you want to kind of package these assets up. And I agree with you, dealing with less government, not more government, is always a good thing in all walks of life. But you're going to need to kind of show me, don't tell me. You're going to need a kind of a flagship project out there to demonstrate exactly how you're going to do what you do, and then cookie cutter after that. So,
That's right.
is there? I know I don't mean to bounce around between
It's okay.
the Mexico fertilizer and the polymetallic nodules, but what are you focused on at the moment whilst you're doing this land grab?
Yeah. So we are advancing projects in two locations now, Mexico for phosphate, which we could talk more about if you have interest, and then Cook Islands for polymetallic nodules. And we're moving them up that value curve I described earlier. So where do they stand at the moment? Mexico project is, it has a 43101 resource estimate, has for some number of years. The pre-feasibility study, for those of your listeners that are mining savvy, you'll understand where we are then in that process by that point of reference, and where we need a single environmental approval to move into extraction. Moving to the Cook Islands, we have investments in two.
Before you do, and how long did that process take? Just remind me.
It's been a long time, and that's part
Okay.
of it. There's a bigger story there because there was a holdup. We started that project in 2012. We secured our original exploration rights. We were on the edge of getting the environmental exploration approval. I'm sorry, the environmental approval to move into production in about 2016. We ran into we had a denial. It was politically motivated. We had to take Mexico to court in Mexico. In 2018, in the highest level court, 11-judge panel, they ruled unanimously that the government had acted unlawfully in denying the permit. Despite that, the project didn't move ahead. We had to bring a case under NAFTA, which we prevailed in late last year. So that project has been elongated, but there have been some particular political interference issues there. Having said that, of course, that is the risk factor, right? That's why that's the biggest hurdle that each of us in this business is going to have to clear, is the regulatory framework, which is important. You know, you mentioned it before, and I'm sure we'll talk about it again. But I think the new momentum is so important for that reason, because early in the cycle, you also rightly called it a nascent business. It is. And when you find yourself in that place, it's hard to get governments comfortable with making decisions on things that have never been done before. But I think we're at that inflection point finally now. So Mexico has taken a long time, and it highlights the risk factor in developing these multi-billion-dollar assets. But once we get that figured out, as you also said, cookie cutter or rinse, wash, and repeat is what I say once we figure this out. So.
Yeah, and you finding that the Claudia Sheinbaum government is more responsive to mining? It certainly is on land. They seem to be doing and saying the right things. Has that been a positive move, post AMLO for you guys as well?
Yeah, I do think the new administration is friendlier to mining and more sensible. And for the president herself has a science background, which I appreciate, because as I said earlier, I think if you look at the science and then on the real impacts, you'll see that you can mitigate the impacts in a way that you can produce an asset that will be really helpful to your society. So while we're here, let me just take one more second on Mexico. Mexico right now imports over 80, I think, well, let's call it more than 50% of the raw phosphate, rock phosphate they need for their fertilizer business. They could turn, that country could turn into a net exporter almost instantly with this project. So President Sheinbaum's science background, I'm hopeful, will be helpful in that if you look at the data, she'll see a way to really help her society move forward in a meaningful way. And to your point, I think, where we started on this element of the discussion, you need someone to go first to prove that this works. And in my experience, it's really hard to get the first person to go first, and then everyone's competing to be second, which is, I think, the inflection point.
Always. So again, just sticking with the phosphate then. You're saying obviously from Mexico could consume a big chunk of what you've got. Are you the people that are going to do that, or how far do you want to take the phosphate project? Because the phosphate market is quite interesting, it's quite complex. Have you got the stomach for that?
Yes, I love your questions, even though this is the first time we've ever spoken. Yeah, so Matthew, the answer on that one is that what we are desirous of is a public-private partnership with the Mexican government. The Mexican government has a fertilizer complex. It's candidly struggling. It needs technology refresh. We could help with that, and it needs the raw input at competitive prices. So they've had a hunger issue for years. I mean, if you look back 2 or 3 administrations, the Nieto administration had a Sin Hambre program, this war against, to defeat hunger. They've got a huge food security problem. And coming back to this particular question you just asked, we don't have any designs on building new fertilizer plants and trying to figure all that out. That's not our core competency. But we can deliver the raw product to the beach. And there they have the resources. And then I think the overage would become export because, even the United States, which is where I'm based, our our phosphate resource is being constrained. Most of it comes from where I'm located here in Central Florida. That supplies the U.S., and they've been mining that since the 1800s. So we're going to need more supplies of this rock phosphate, as will other nations.
Right. So obviously we're talking about public-private partnership there, and also I think Caplat have invested a little bit as well. How do you kind of fund this portion of this commercial opportunity? To deal with your own commitments, and how much time are you going to have to commit in terms of helping the Mexican government with other kind of strategic partners who may want to come in and do part of that processing, because there's a consortium type of approach to it, isn't there?
Yeah, it is. So look, I think the most important thing we've done in the past 6 months is formed the joint venture with Caplat. Caplat is led by a gentleman who's a very respected businessman in the agri-food business in Mexico, so he's directly in the space. Juan Cortino Gallardo runs a company called Siembra, sugar producer, one of the biggest sugar producers in Mexico. He's also got other agriculture logistical businesses. He's also the head of something called CNA, which is essentially an association of farmers and agriculture and agri-food producers in Mexico. They represent that organization represents 80% of the GDP in agri-food produced in Mexico. So having the right partner to help us navigate the best way to put together the partnership that you're talking about was really important. He's very committed. Juan and I have known each other for several years prior to forming this joint venture. He and I probably spend no less than 10 hours a week in intense calls, all hours of the nights and weekends. He's very focused on advancing the project. By the way, for the good of Mexico, the part that we were just talking about, it'll really help his country, and he sees it as a really good business. He's voted with his wallet. You kind of referenced that. We did a $4 million capital raise at Odyssey back in December. Juan led that, took a full third of it personally. Some of his executives joined him in that, so they're very committed to the project. They see the future. In terms of the other part of your question about how that partnership will be formed and what we bring to the party, we have partners. An example is a company called Novafos, which has a really unique fertilizer processing technology that we're working to demonstrate could bring radical process improvement to the existing infrastructure, fertilizer infrastructure. And after that, the fertilizer business in Mexico is a state-owned enterprise. It's a division of Pemex. What's been the state-owned oil company owns the fertilizer complex. So our vision would be that we would use our expertise to be able to find, locate, and extract using our partner Royal Boscalis, the raw rock phosphate, deliver it to the beach, and from there, Mexico has the infrastructure needed to convert it into finished product for the market. And then we would additionally help by bringing these technology overlay pieces to help improve their fertilizer business. Not a capital investment from us. That would be leveraging our extensive partner network to help Mexico. Now, we will need capital, obviously, for our element of the business. That would be raised at the joint venture level, not at the OMEX or Odyssey Marine Exploration level. And Odyssey will own, roughly 30% of that joint venture as we get it started down in Mexico.
Right, and okay, 30%, right. So can you give me your, I appreciate any feasibility work done so far might be is out of date and maybe things have changed, etc. But can you give us a sense of the opportunity here, the financial opportunity for you?
Yeah, so, rock phosphate, it's a commodity, obviously varies in price. It's in about the $150 a ton range right now. Our initial plan from an environmental, what we've applied for inside the environmental license would be about 3 million tons a year. So you're talking about a few $100 million a year in revenue just from the rock, and that's our business. The downstream fertilizer is not us. We are refining the economic models right now. But we believe that there'd be at least a 30% gross margin in those revenues based on the fact that, and referencing back to what I said earlier, we're going to use existing dredge ships that are going to be slightly modified in terms of screening, so we don't have a big CapEx expenditure. And the OpEx will be controlled, and I think that, as I mentioned, I think that you're probably looking at a 30% or better gross margin in that business.
Okay, so can we treat the Phosphate Project as a slight outlier? I appreciate you saying we're chasing minerals, valuable minerals from the sea, well, offshore, right? Will you be looking at other phosphate projects, or was this?
Yeah, we do have other phosphate projects. Interestingly, with the advent of the executive order, there are some potential phosphate projects off the United States that would be in the regulatory control of the U.S. under the Bureau of Energy Management, BOEM. Odyssey actually saw that opportunity early on. We've actually been a qualified BOEM bidder since 2021, so nearly 4 years now. Problem was the regulatory framework wasn't favorable to advance it. And I think now with this new executive order, we're seeing a refresh of the regulatory framework in the United States, which may allow us to apply for certain projects. Phosphate and other minerals, by the way, there's also nodules, but yes, so we have phosphate projects here, and we also have identified some interesting opportunities in the Caribbean and other parts of South America.
Okay, well, let's bounce over to the Cook Islands. I think you're about to tell us about that. So what are you doing there?
Yeah, so the Cook Islands is a super exciting opportunity. They have polymetallic nodules. They're heavy in cobalt, which is interesting because depending on where you find them in the ocean, in other words, nickel content is higher for the nodules that we're finding in the Clarion, not we're finding, but companies like the Metals Company is finding in the Clarion-Clipperton zone. So they're complementary because both metals are obviously needed. The regulatory framework, the government that's been in place for a number of years has been very stable, very focused on developing this opportunity responsibly for the good of their people. And they've issued 3 exploration licenses. Odyssey's invested in 2 of the 3 license holders, a company called CIC, which is run by Odyssey's founder, who I succeeded as CEO of Odyssey. OML is the second company that we're invested in. OML are people we've dealt with for many years on other projects as well. So we have a lot of good history with those 2 operators. We provide services to both those operators. One of our forms of contribution to get our equity stake in OML was putting one of Odyssey's 6,000 meter rated remotely operated vehicles aboard their ship that's doing the exploration work. OML has their initial JORC report. They have a $4.7 billion valuation on their resource at the moment. I think they're about to release an upgraded JORC. I don't know, and they haven't published what the values will be. When you can look at CIC, they haven't issued a JORC yet, but their license area is 10 times the size of OML. So even if you just say they're the same, you've got nearly $9 billion of value across those two investments. Odyssey currently owns approximately 6% of OML and approximately 15% of CIC.
Right.
And the last thing, Matthew, I'm sorry. The other point I wanted to make is they're 3 years into their exploration program. Obviously, they've gotten to the point where they've quantified their resource, done a lot of their environmental work. So I think in terms of when you look ahead at catalysts and value drivers, we could be seeing trial extraction licenses issued, sometime relatively soon, which would be a big value. That's a big value driver on that value curve I've mentioned before.
Well, it's kind of interesting. I think is an oft-quoted line in conventional mining is these days from discovery through to production is 19 years. Terrifying, right? Conventional mining. So the time that sorry,
there's a lot to do to get there. So
Yeah. Well, like there's a lot of overburden and a lot of tunneling and all those wonderful things. Okay, so with regards to discussions with sort of, because there's a kind of assumption here, and I'm sorry to make it, but that it's once you've kind of got the license to extract, it's relatively simple for you to pick up these polymetallic nodules from the surface and take it to shore. It then needs to be process, or the downstream battery metal or EV supply chain companies or their partners will be interested in this. So are you in discussions with any of these guys for offtakes? Is there any kind of commercial components what you're doing at the moment?
Yeah, so in terms of polymetallic nodules, since Odyssey has a minority position in both of those entities, by the way, by comparison, our ownership interest, it's a controlled subsidiary of Odyssey, the Mexican project, but in the Cook Islands. So we're not involved in those discussions that you're asking about, but they are. I wouldn't be in a position to confidently, speak to where they stand. They have been doing test processing, bench level test processing. They have been in discussions for offtake agreements with all of the likely suspects you might imagine. And so that is the logical next step. In Mexico, we've already spoken about it, but the equivalent would be us having discussions and developing our bench tests to make sure that it would work in the existing processing facilities that exist.
Right. Okay. Understood. So let's talk about the, I guess, financial strategy, funding, capital markets, all those wonderful things. I think the first thing people look at was obviously the share price took a hit last year. Expectations were high. And I think some people are disappointed. Can you just talk around that?
Sure. Yeah, absolutely. So, the price destruction in OMEX that happened in roughly mid-September, starting September 17th, was a reaction to the NAFTA ruling. So I think there were a lot of people understandably playing the outcome of NAFTA as an investment thesis. The claim could have potentially been worth $2 billion or more. What happened was while we won the case, the damages award was disappointingly low, about $60 million between the damage award and the penalty interest. We had funded the $25 million in legal expense. That was a 5-year process, the NAFTA legal process, using non-recourse debt, which was the sensible thing to do because, it was a complicated international treaty dispute case that could have gone either way, and we couldn't have afforded to lose $25 million. So it was non-recourse. We wouldn't have owed the money if we didn't prevail. If we did prevail, we owed the litigation funder a multiple of the money, which also at the time we made that deal seem sensible because we were looking at potentially, call it a $500 million to $2 billion outcome. In this case, the punchline here is that Odyssey will end up with none of those proceeds. That's what precipitated the value destruction. A lot of big holders just exiting that were playing that outcome. I think the opportunity off that moving forward is we're not looking at the transactional value of the litigation outcome. We're looking to build on the fact that yet another court now a world court administered by World Bank, has said that the environmental denial was unjust. We do have this new administration in Mexico. We were talking about it earlier, who I think, in combination with us having selected the right partner that understands how to navigate that regulatory regime, we can now have a productive discussion. And instead of Mexico having to pay a significant NAFTA damages claim, we could figure out how to fix a bunch of different things together and create value together. So that was what caused the value destruction, and where I think how we play that going forward, that we just use it as an opportunity to form a mutually beneficial partnership, and that's our objective.
Okay, and so just looking at the kind of share register now, do you think there's a job to be done in terms of making sure you've kind of got the right types of investors on board, and what would you be looking to try to achieve there?
Yeah, absolutely. So we spend a lot of time since September understanding that we need to be able to educate a broader market on what the long-term opportunity is, which is what we're discussing here today, right? That there's no doubt a resource out there. There's no doubt risk, but once you solve for the regulatory issue, you're at the very front end. I often think of the parallel between actually offshore oil and gas and how there had to be a catalyst, which in the case of offshore oil and gas, the technology and opportunity existed in the 1950s and 60s, but it wasn't until the Arab oil embargo of the early 1970s that there was a catalyst that drove the move. And I think we're right at that same moment in time right now. I think, we've got to capitalize, on that opportunity. We have to find that government that, is willing to be first to go first. We're hoping that's Mexico, and I think the Cook Islands is demonstrating that they're there as well. So we're really happy with where we're positioned. We've got to show that it can be done. Technically, it's no question it's technically feasible. It's economically feasible. We touched on that a few minutes ago. But we've got to get one into production.
Well, yeah, exactly the point. I think that was from the outset. I was just trying to understand what those flagships are. I think we've done a good job of talking through those. Just in terms of the kind of financial setup for you guys now, obviously you're not burning through a whole ton of capex, which is something, until you get these kind of firmer cues as to where you spend your time, money, and effort. But are you good for money at the moment? And what does that spend look like currently?
Yeah, we are. And it's interesting, but a volume of Odyssey's cash burn is fairly fixed and related to the cost of being a publicly traded company, which we must stay. It's millions of dollars a year, even for a microcap, between the expense of public company audits, the insurance, all of the different trappings that you need to have in place to be a public company. Having said that, and answering your question directly now, yeah, we're well positioned. We raised $4 million in December. Most recently, we announced that we had $2 million in warrant and option executions. It comes from a group that are the investors that have been long-term investors and believe in the story. And they've remained good supporters over an extended period of time, and I expect they still will. So I think that's our primary source of capital for the near future. Also, as we get into the bigger expenses, I referenced this before, but some things will be done outside of Odyssey, and for instance, particularly Mexico, big expenses in the joint venture. But project financing as well is something we've used in the past. So elements of debt or project-specific financing are ways we'll be able to finance capital needs without additional dilutive impact.
Right, and obviously, again, that word nascent comes up a lot. With projects like this, is people's understanding of the risk grows. Do you think you're going to be able to look at and access some of these other kind of like non-dilutive financing options? You talk about doing stuff outside of Odyssey, but things again. He was slightly more commercial now, royalties and streaming and equities and government grants and those sorts of things. Do you think they'll become more common?
Yeah, we're seeing that. In fact, interestingly, about a month ago, I was in Washington, D.C., meeting with several different executive branch agencies that are looking at establishing programs now. And this was prior to the executive order being issued. I was there about 2 weeks prior to the executive order. So we're seeing that was never something that would have been on the table before. So I think we're seeing that come in to fruition. I think the other thing we'll see as we move beyond the nascent stage is more of the strategic type investments. Could be in the form of offtake agreements, for instance, that capital can come in based on calls on future production as opposed to dilutive equity raises. So yeah, I think. And interesting, I guess I really hadn't thought about it until we were talking today that maybe this is another parallel to terrestrial mining. We're kind of catching up to where the conventional financing mechanisms that have been available in that space are starting to become available, but it's nascent, right? So
it is. Okay, well, look, Mark, it's a really nice kind of romp through the company, the project opportunities, and I guess. The thing I'd like to sort of walk away with understanding is in terms of timeframes for this, some of the things you're in control of, some of them you're not. I mean, I know patience is always required and always sensible investing, but what are we looking at?
I'm so bad at patience, Matthew, I'll tell you. I got to get better at it after all these years doing this. But yeah, so I think that as we look ahead, I think that investors that start to look at our story, should be looking at how news flow emerges from Mexico and the Cook Islands in terms of these projects progressing. For Mexico would be, potentially we get to a point where we'll be able to talk about the discussions we're having in more detail. And I think that could be, say in the coming 90 days. For the Cook Islands, I think there you'll see enhanced resource estimate productions, and hopefully there'll be news from the government there. That one, again, minority shareholders, so I'm not as in control of that dialogue, but hopefully within the coming 6 to 12 months, we'll see those projects advancing, hopefully at least with trial extraction on the table. So I think those are kind of the catalysts that are immediately ahead, and I think some of them, could come out, and like I said, as soon as the coming 30 to 90 days.
Okay, well, look, Mark, I look forward to hearing more from you on this. I think it's a super exciting space, and I say with the executive order coming out, it kind of maybe clears the air somewhat. And stay in touch. I'll speak to you soon.
Okay, yeah, it was great speaking with you, Matthew.